Alright, starting chapter 26 on page 403. We're talking about the Cold War and the years of conflict here. We've got a quote from a speech there by Ronald Reagan. He said, "I urge you to beware the temptation to declare yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil." And that speech became very famous as the Evil Empire speech. And he was addressing the issues that people were blaming both sides, both the communists and the United States, for the arms war, when really both sides were at fault, but at the same time, the communists, as Reagan said, they truly were an evil empire. They were killing millions of their own people, forcing millions onto collectives where they often starved to death or died of diseases. There were concentration camps in Siberia that were pretty bad. So really both sides could not be considered entirely equal. So turning to page 404, we're looking at the formation of the United Nations here. Highlight that the first official meeting of the UN General Assembly took place in London on January 10th, 1946. Highlight that the United Nations now occupies its new building in New York, and they started that in 1952. So they got the land in New York from the United States, and also a loan of $65 million. And still today, most of the UN's funding comes from the United States. When there's a war that the United Nations participates in, most of the peacekeeping troops are from the United States. So all in all, the United States funds it a lot, but gets very few benefits, and often gets a lot of the blame for different wars and conflicts that the United Nations is mostly to blame for. Next thing to highlight is on page 405 under the Cold War begins. Highlight global conflict developed, and highlight that this was a Cold War. Know the definition for a Cold War. It's a war fought not with weapons, but with words, diplomacy, and ideology. Highlight those that were arrayed against each other. It was the free world versus the communist bloc. Turning to page 406. Highlight Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Highlight that they were convicted of treason and executed in 1953. They were passing along information to communist agents. Highlight Klaus Fuchs, and highlight that he was the director of Britain's nuclear research program. And highlight that he was convicted in 1950. He was supplying Moscow with top-secret trigger mechanisms that could detonate the atomic bomb. Highlight Joseph McCarthy. He exposed communist activity in the State Department, the entertainment and intellectual community, and even in the army. There was a lot of controversy around his confusion, so McCarthy came under criticism and personal attack. And many of his conclusions were technically unprovable, but they were drawn from the accumulation of undisputed facts. People came to call this McCarthyism, and they often would use the term to make fun of McCarthy and use it for baseless accusations. But really, he had uncovered a lot of truth. There was just no way of proving it. On the next column, highlight the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill coined this term in 1946 for the tyranny and oppression that descended upon the nations of Eastern Europe. So you can see there in our map the division of East and West Germany. So West Germany was taken by the Allies, East Germany taken along with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary and other nations by the Soviet Union. And then we've got a little black blip there in East Germany, and that is Berlin. So even though it's located in East Germany, it was also divided into West Berlin and East Berlin. And it became really a symbol of the division between the free world and the communist world. So on page 407, highlight containing communist expansion, and highlight that it became known as the Truman Doctrine. So it's the idea of containment rather than getting rid of communism. It was going to keep communism contained to where it already was and prevent it from spreading to other nations. All in all, a bad plan. They should have pushed back against communism and ended it, but they did not. Turning the page to page 408, highlight the Berlin airlift. And this was an enormous effort on the part of the free world. Western Berlin was blockaded by the Soviets, and there were 2.25 million people that were on the verge of starvation thanks to this. So highlight the Berlin airlift and highlight winter of 1948 to 1949. At one point, American transport planes were landing in West Berlin every 45 seconds. They were bringing food, medicine, fuel, and other necessities. The blockade was lifted in May of 1949, but the airlift continued until September. And it was a good demonstration of the United States' power during this time. Next, highlight the date, April 1949, and highlight the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It was delineating a security area in the North Atlantic and Western Europe. So it was designed to oppose the communist bloc. Top of the second column, highlight defensive military alliance in Eastern Europe called the Warsaw Pact. And this was the counteract to NATO. The the Soviet Union denounced NATO as an aggressive alliance. So they came up with this Warsaw Pact to oppose it. Next, highlight Nikita Khrushchev and highlight that he was the new leader of Russia. And you can see a picture of him there. He gave the false impression that Soviet communism was mellowing and that there was a de-Stalinization. But it was all pretty fake, and it was just tactics on the side of Khrushchev to get people to accept communism more. On the next page, highlight Marshal Tito. Highlight that he was the dictator of Yugoslavia and that he established his own brand of communism. Next, highlight the symbol of Soviet oppression in Eastern Europe was the Berlin Wall. And highlight the date, 1961. That's when the wall was built. And they built it because since 1949, over 2 million East Germans had fled to the West to escape the oppression of communism. So it was a testament of just how horrific communism was. And the communists couldn't have that. They couldn't have their half of the city emptied as people were fleeing to the free half. So it was the first time in history that a wall was built to keep people inside their own country rather than to keep their enemies out. So you might want to know that. There were armed guards, barbed wire, searchlights, and other defenses to keep people there. On the second column, highlight Konrad Adenauer and highlight that he was the leadership necessary for West Germany to recover from wartime defeat. So he promptly moved the nation to a vigorous free market economy, and he transformed Western Germany into one of the most prosperous nations in the world. By 1955, just 10 years after the war had ended, West Germany was producing more goods and services than the entire nation had in 1936 under Hitler's National Socialism. And this formed a very strong contrast to Eastern Germany. And I would encourage you to look up online. You can find documentaries and pictures and things that contrast West and East Germany at this time. West Germany was rebuilding, becoming extremely prosperous. The people were doing well. Whereas in East Germany, in many places, they had yet to rebuild what had been bombed out and broken down by the war. People were broke. They were constantly on the brink of famine and starvation, and it was just kind of, it was a very strong contrast there. On page 410, highlight Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, and Harold Macmillan, and highlight that under their leadership, British industry and defense improved during the 1950s and early 1960s. Sadly, though, in spite of this, the Conservatives were not able to keep power, and they did not dismantle the welfare system put in place by the Labour Party. Morality declined, and churches were virtually empty every Sunday. Still today, there are many places in England where there are church buildings that have been, they've stood empty for decades. And sadly, in a lot of places, some of them are being bought up and turned into pubs and bars. Kind of a sad testament of how far Britain has fallen from its Christian days. Okay, highlight the British Commonwealth of Nations. Know what that is. Highlight Charles de Gaulle. He was the leader of the Free French government during World War II. He returned to power, he helped to write a new constitution, and he established the Fifth Republic. And interestingly, even though he had hated the Germans during World War II, he cooperated closely with the new German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer. So they're able to overcome their differences and form a good cooperation there. In Italy, highlight Alcide de Gasperi. And know him for the leadership of Italy. And let's see. Okay, Spain. So Franco and the nationalist forces won the Spanish Civil War. And Franco managed to keep his country neutral in World War II, in spite of the fact that Germany had helped him with his civil war. But they opposed the communists. So the Soviet Union launched a propaganda campaign calling for opposition to Franco and the overthrow of his anti-communist government. So Spain and the United States agreed to a 10-year economic and military pact that allowed the Americans to build bases in Spain. Meanwhile, Spain would receive over $1 billion in grants and loans. And thanks to American aid, Spain achieved one of the world's highest rates of economic growth during the 50s and 60s. Sadly, though, Franco, in spite of his leadership in bringing this about, this would not have happened without the United States aid. Franco, don't let this fool you into believing that Franco was a good guy. He was not a good guy. He killed many tens of thousands of his own countrymen. Anyone who opposed him was killed. He also had a secret police that would, sneak in and arrest people, and nobody was allowed to speak out against the government. Nobody was allowed to be anything besides a Catholic. And if people were unwilling to baptize their children in the Catholic Church, they would usually be arrested and have their children taken away from them. The kids would then be put into an orphanage or adopted by families who were willing to raise them as Catholics. And the entire reason why he agreed to this 10-year economic pact was because his country was doing so poorly. It was so broken, and the economy was falling apart. So without that, Franco would not be known today as a great leader. And a lot of times we look at the results of something rather than what was happening during the time. So you can't just look at the results, you've got to look at everything that happened along the way. And Franco, this is definitely true about him. So that's the last of the highlights for today. Make sure you get your homework done. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great weekend.